One cold sentence from human resources made me realize that sometimes a company does not stay silent because it does not know you are being treated unfairly. It stays silent because that unfairness is making someone money. I used to think I was just an ordinary inventory employee, someone who counted products, recorded numbers, and did her job properly. But when my overtime pay disappeared for months, and when every polite complaint was brushed aside, I had to learn how to stop asking permission to be treated fairly. And on the day the labor department walked into the building, the person who once said my problem was not a priority finally learned what a real priority looked like. This is not a priority right now. Diane Parker said those words to me in a flat voice, as if she were reading a harmless note from a meeting calendar instead of dismissing 8 months of wages that had been taken out of my life. I was standing in the Human Resources office for the third time in 6 weeks, both hands gripping the stack of papers where I'd written down my working hours. My throat so dry that every sentence felt like it was scraping against sandpaper. I had explained everything again, that 1 week I worked 47 hours. Another week, more than 50. And some weeks stretched so long that my body could no longer tell the difference between weekdays and weekends. But every hour, over 40 had disappeared from my paycheck because one morning I was told I had become a salaried exempt employee. Even though my work had not changed at all, I still counted products, checked manifests, and reconciled incoming shipments. Only my money had disappeared. Diane did not even lift her head immediately. The pen in her hand kept circling over the paper, leaving small, meaningless marks, while I stood there listening to my heartbeat in my ears. In that moment, I did not feel shattered. No. The feeling was more like a crack. Like a glass that falls to the floor but does not break into pieces yet. It still looks whole. But you know it is no longer the same inside. I looked at Diane, at the clean desk, at the neatly arranged files, and realized that in the place that was supposed to protect employees, I had become nothing more than an item pushed to the bottom of a list. My name is Emma Reed. And before all of this happened, I never imagined I could be the kind of woman who made an entire company tremble. I was not someone who enjoyed making noise. And I definitely was not someone who invited trouble into her life. I fixed things that were off. I found wrong numbers. I made sure shipments went where they were supposed to go. I worked in inventory. A place with no glamour, no grand presentations, and no promises about strategic vision. Everything there was measured in orders, boxes, actual quantities received, and delivery times. If a carton said 60 units but only contained 58, I was the person who caught it. If the system showed that a shipment arrived on Tuesday but the truck actually reached the warehouse on Wednesday, I documented it. Some people think details like that are small. But in my line of work, details are not a side issue. Details are the entire job. I started at the company 3 years before everything exploded. Back then I was hourly blank. I clocked in at 7 in the morning, usually left at 4 in the afternoon. Unless there was a major shipment. When I stayed late, I was paid properly. And that made the arrangement clear and honest. Work the hours. Receive the pay. I liked that simplicity. Nobody told me I was changing the world. But every day I knew I had done something useful. I verified quantities, moved inventory to the right areas, and made sure the distribution centers got what they ordered. Then, I went home, ate a dinner, slept, and came back the next morning. It was a plain routine, but at least it was honest. My first manager was Margaret Blake. She had been with the company for almost her entire working life. And she had the quiet kind of decency that I would miss more and more later on. On my first day, she handed me a coffee mug that said, "Counting on you," with a smiley face printed under the words, then told me that in this warehouse, anyone who could count carefully was more reliable than any software. Margaret taught me the system. She showed me which suppliers were always on time and which ones tended to short their shipments by a few percent, hoping nobody would check. I checked, and she liked that. When Margaret retired, the company brought in Vanessa Cole. Vanessa was in her early 30s, always dressed in sharp suits, her hair pulled back tightly, her face carrying a smile that looked carefully rehearsed. She had moved through several companies in only a few years and left each one with a higher title. Leadership called it ambition, talent, and an ability to exceed targets. I only saw a woman who knew how to make numbers look better on paper. Vanessa walked through the warehouse, remembered names, asked about birthdays and weekends, but her eyes were never fully inside the conversation. They were always calculating, measuring, searching for places to cut. 6 months after Vanessa arrived, she gathered our department in the break room and announced a series of promotions. My name was on the list. If you have ever felt that a workplace gift sounded too good to be true, comment number 1 below. Because I felt that warning in my gut too. But I was not brave enough yet to trust it. I was named Senior Inventory Coordinator, a title that sounded much brighter. And the annual salary she announced made a few people turn toward me and congratulate me. After that meeting, I went back to my desk and started doing the math. The new salary looked like progress at first, $52,000 a year. Before that, with hourly pay and regular overtime, I had been earning about $48,000. $4,000 more looked like a reward on paper. But once I placed it beside the 50-hour weeks I was already working, sometimes even more, the picture changed immediately. If I continued working 10 extra hours every week without overtime, that raise was really a way to buy my time more cheaply. I went to Vanessa's office the next day with my calculations written down because I did not want emotion to overwhelm logic. I told her I had questions about the pay structure. Vanessa invited me to sit, her smile still perfectly in place. So perfect that it felt cold. When I said the hourly breakdown seemed lower than what I had been earning before when overtime was included, she leaned forward and told me I needed to stop thinking like an hourly employee. According to her, I was now being paid for the value I brought, for greater responsibility, greater prestige, and a stronger career path. I asked what the higher responsibility actually was. She talked about strategic inventory management, autonomy, and decision-making authority. But in my mind, I saw the same boxes, the same receiving slips, the same shelves, and the same counts I had always handled. I did not manage anyone. I did not make strategic decisions. I was doing the same work in the same place with the same hands. When I asked whether I could remain hourly, Vanessa's smile tightened like a wire. She asked whether I did not want to move forward in my career. And the question made my face burn, as if I were the unreasonable one. That night, I sat at the small table in my one-bedroom apartment for hours. The apartment was about a 15-minute drive from work. Not large, but enough for me to live steadily. I had been there for 4 years. Never late on rent. Never spending beyond what I could handle. I wrote the numbers again and again. But the math could not completely defeat the words Vanessa had planted in my head: growth, trust, opportunity, title. I wondered whether I was being too suspicious. Was I ungrateful for questioning a promotion? Was I, as a woman who had started in an ordinary warehouse role, supposed to grab every chance to move up? That was the most dangerous part of the way Vanessa spoke. She did not force me with a crude order. She made me doubt my own judgment. By Friday, I accepted the new position. The first month was not terrible. I worked a little over 40 hours and told myself maybe everything would be fine. The second month, my hours climbed close to 50. By the third month, Vanessa began sending messages on Friday afternoons, requiring everyone to come in Saturday morning to count inventory before a large shipment. Those weekend shifts were called mandatory. But on my paycheck, they did not exist as time worth additional compensation. When I asked about pay, Vanessa calmly said I was salaried now, and that it was part of the job. If you are still watching and this story makes you angry, please like the video. Because sometimes a like is one small way of saying that stories like this should not be treated as normal. By the fourth month, I worked 61 hours in a single week. I remember that number, not because it appeared on my paycheck, but because it lived in my bones. My back hurt when I bent down to check cartons. My eyes ached from staring at product codes for too long. Some evenings I came home, opened my apartment door, and stood still in the entryway without enough energy to turn on the light. Dishes piled up in the sink. Clean clothes stayed in the basket. Friends' messages went unanswered. And I kept telling myself that things would ease after this shipment. But one shipment led into another. One weekend into the next. I started documenting everything in a notebook I kept at home. Because part of me knew that if the whole truth lived inside the company's system, it could disappear the same way my overtime had disappeared. Every day, I wrote down when I arrived, when I left, what tasks I completed, which shipments I handled, and how many units I counted. I also wrote down my conversations with Vanessa. Every time she implied that if I did not show up on a weekend, someone else would be happy to have my position. I wrote down the moments when she praised my commitment, as if praise could replace wages. At first, keeping the notebook made me feel a little extreme, but after a few weeks, it became the only thing that made reality feel solid in my hands. Each page was proof that I was not imagining this. I had been there. I had worked those hours. I had become so tired, I forgot what day it was. And the company still acted as if my time had no value beyond the salary they had attached to me. Once exhaustion stopped feeling like a private condition, I began looking around more carefully. During breaks, I heard sighs that sounded like mine. I saw once cheerful faces turn pale and worn after weekend shifts. Then I discovered that 7 other people in my department had received the same kind of promotion. All of us had once been hourly. All of us had been given titles that sounded higher. All of us were working 50 and 60-hour weeks without overtime pay. We spoke quietly in the parking lot, in the break room, beside the vending machine when no manager was walking by. Nobody wanted to be the first person to complain officially. Everyone needed the job. Someone was paying off a car. Someone had children. Someone had just moved. The fear of losing income kept us silent, even though that silence was costing us income every single week. I remember one coworker saying she felt as if she had been trapped by the word advancement. That sentence stayed with me for a long time, because it was true. If they had openly cut our pay, people might have reacted immediately. But they did not call it a pay cut. They called it an opportunity. They wrapped the loss in a title, in praise, in professional expectation. And when you questioned it, they made you feel petty, unambitious, unable to see the bigger picture. Those quiet conversations made me understand that this was no longer just Emma Reed's personal problem. It was a pattern. A pattern repeated widely enough that it could not be dismissed as a mistake. The more I looked at it, the more it resembled a deliberate decision. The final clue came from someone in accounting. They mentioned casually that Vanessa had received a very large year-end bonus because department costs had dropped dramatically. I asked how much, and the answer made me go cold. 38%. 38% was not a small saving from buying cheaper paper or arranging shelves more efficiently. I went home, opened my notebook, and placed the numbers beside one another. If multiple people who used to receive overtime were still working the same hours but now receiving only fixed salaries, the savings for the company would reach tens of thousands of dollars. Possibly more once other departments were included. That money did not vanish. It moved. It left our pockets, entered the cost reports, and turned Vanessa into an excellent manager in the eyes of senior leadership. At that moment, everything became painfully clear. This was not a promotion. This was reclassification to avoid paying overtime. This was wage theft dressed up in a prettier title. I spent 3 days reading the labor rules related to overtime exemptions. I read slowly, underlined passages, and looked up every term I did not understand. To be exempt from overtime, a worker's duties have to meet specific standards, such as primarily involving management or significant independent judgment in important business matters. I had none of that authority. I did not hire anyone, fire anyone, set budgets, or make strategic decisions. I counted products, checked shipments, and organized inventory. If you have not subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel now. Because stories like this need to be told, so more people understand that a polished title cannot replace lawful pay. After reading labor law until my eyes blurred, I scheduled a meeting with Diane Parker in Human Resources. The first time, I still tried to keep everything gentle. I did not use the words wage theft. I did not accuse Vanessa directly. I simply said there might have been a classification error with my position. I thought that if I presented the issue calmly, perhaps they would review it. Diane's office smelled like artificial vanilla mixed with old paper. She sat behind her desk, hair neat, her face trained to show just enough listening. I explained my actual duties, said I did not supervise employees, did not make independent decisions about major business matters, and that my hours were regularly exceeding 40 a week. Diane wrote a few lines in her notebook and said the company's legal team had reviewed the positions, but she would double-check. I left the office with a small amount of cautious hope. Not much, but enough to keep me from filing a complaint immediately. 2 weeks passed. No email. No phone call. No pay adjustment. I was still working long weeks. Still coming in on weekends. Still seeing the same paycheck. There is a kind of disappointment that does not make noise. It does not slam doors or shout. It simply sits beside you every morning when you badge into work and reminds you that we will look into. It can be a more polite way of saying go away. I realized that if I did not return with stronger evidence, they would treat the first meeting like the tired sigh of an exhausted employee and let it sink into a drawer. The second time I met with Diane, I brought documents. Not just feelings. Not just my version of events. I printed the guidelines related to employee classification, listed my daily duties, and included records showing that I was regularly working more than 40 hours. I prepared as if I were walking into a professional meeting. Because I still believed the issue could be solved internally if I was clear enough, Diane looked at the papers I placed in front of her. But her expression was not the expression of someone who had just seen a problem that needed fixing. It looked more like she had just seen an inconvenience that needed managing. She said the company's lawyers had reviewed every position and that I was classified correctly. I kept my voice steady and said my job was inventory work. That I did not manage anyone and did not make business decisions. Diane replied that I exercised professional judgment in my role. That I made determinations about inventory allocation. I said the system already determined where products needed to go based on existing orders. And I only verified quantities and organized the process according to instructions. She repeated that this still required professional judgment. The way Diane spoke sounded like a script prepared in advance. There was no curiosity. No real question. No intention to understand my work beyond the terms that benefited the company. I sat there across from a human resources director and felt myself shrink inside my own story. That was the worst feeling, not being challenged with truth, but being erased with administrative language. When I left her office, the stack of papers felt lighter in my hands. But my heart felt much heavier. Because evidence only matters when the person receiving it is willing to look. 6 weeks later, I went back for the third time. This time, I no longer had the strength to perform perfect calm. That month, Vanessa had scheduled 3 weekend inventory counts. I worked weeks so long that my body felt stretched thin all the time. My apartment became evidence of exhaustion, dishes in the sink. Floors not vacuumed. Mail unopened. Refrigerator almost empty. I stopped seeing friends because I was either working or too tired to pretend I was fine. When I walked into Diane's office, I did not sit down immediately. I told her directly that I was working nearly 60 hours a week while being paid the same as before. That it was not legal. That I had read the regulations and documented everything. My voice shook. But not because I was afraid of saying the wrong thing. It shook because I had held too much in for too long. Diane looked at me for a few seconds and did not take notes the way she had before. Her face was hard to read. Maybe she was tired. Maybe annoyed. Maybe professionally indifferent. Then she said the sentence, "This was not a priority right now." Those words landed in the room like a lock snapping shut. I looked at her and understood that. In their eyes. The problem was not that my wages had been taken. The problem would only exist if I stopped staying quiet. I left her office, went to my car, and sat in the parking lot for about 20 minutes. I did not cry. Even though I wanted to, the anger inside me was too thick, too hot, leaving no room for tears. It sat in my chest, heavy and sharp. And for the first time, I understood that there are moments when politeness stops being a virtue. It becomes a betrayal of yourself. That night, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The State Labor Department website was not unfamiliar to me. I had looked at it many times during the previous weeks. But each time I had closed it because filing an official complaint felt too big, too confrontational. I had thought of it as dropping a bomb on the company when all I wanted was a fair conversation. But I had tried conversation 3 times. I had used the proper internal channels, spoken politely, brought documents, and given them chances to fix the problem without anyone losing face. They had done nothing. The complaint form was long, detailed, and cold. It asked for employee information, employé information, a description of the violation, and supporting documents. I filled out each section slowly, carefully, almost to the point of a headache. I did not want to exaggerate anything. I knew that one small mistake could be used to weaken the whole story. I listed every hour I had worked over 8 months, attached my job description, and described my actual daily tasks. I included the names of coworkers who had been reclassified in the same way, not to drag them into trouble, but to prove this was not an isolated incident. Then I added, the most important part, Vanessa's bonus structure was directly tied to reducing department costs, and the major cost reduction had come from unpaid overtime labor. When I clicked submit, it was 2 a.m. I closed the laptop, turned off the light, and lay down. But sleep did not come. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, wondering whether I had just saved myself or burned down my entire career. The fear was real, but beneath it was another feeling for the first time in months. I had done something that did not require their permission. 4 days after submitting the complaint, life in the warehouse continued, as if nothing had happened. I still arrived on time, held my clipboard, counted units, answered emails, and walked past Vanessa's office with the most ordinary expression I could manage. But inside me, every sound felt like a tightened wire. Every time my phone vibrated, I thought maybe it was the labor department calling. Every time a manager walked by, I wondered if they knew. There was no clear confirmation email, no phone call, no sign that my complaint had reached a real human being. I started doubting myself. Had I actually clicked submit, had one of the attachments failed, would some agency take months to open the file then? On Thursday afternoon, Vanessa's assistant ran through the warehouse. I say ran because that is what she truly did. Normally, she moved in a controlled way, fast enough to look busy, but never out of command. That day, her shoes struck the concrete floor in rapid beats, and her face was pale. She asked where Diane was, then said the labor department was in the building and requesting payroll records for the entire department. I was counting a shipment of industrial supplies that had just arrived. My hand held a pen. My eyes were on the rows of product. But my heart was pounding so hard, I thought the whole warehouse might hear it. I had read that labor investigators often do not call ahead. They arrive unexpectedly because if they give advance warning, a company has time to fix records. I document, temporarily change classifications, and then return to normal later. I bent down and continued writing the count, forcing each stroke of the pen to slow down. I had waited for the truth to appear, but when it finally walked through the door, I still trembled. The atmosphere in the warehouse changed immediately. It did not explode, but it thickened. Managers walked faster, spoke quietly into their phones, their faces tight, as if they had just heard terrible news. I saw 2 strangers in business clothing being led toward the administrative wing, carrying folders and briefcases, their expressions free of unnecessary friendliness. They were not there to be entertained by the company. They were there to inspect it. I finished the shipment in front of me, signed it off, and moved to the next task. Part of me wanted to stare toward the offices, to know exactly what was happening behind those doors. But another part of me clung to the work like it was the ground under my feet. I had learned over the years that when everything becomes chaotic, the numbers still need to be right. About an hour later, I heard footsteps approaching. Diane stood there with another human resources employee I had seen before but never spoken to. Both of them looked as if they had aged in a single afternoon. Diane no longer carried that calm smell of vanilla and old paper. She looked at me with a strained expression and asked why I had not told them I had contacted the labor department. I set down my clipboard. I told her I had told her 3 times. Diane said I had not told her I was going to file a formal state complaint. I looked directly at her and said she had told me my concern was not a priority. So I had made it one. The other HR employee said this was a serious issue, that the company could have handled it internally, and that now investigators were requesting documents from multiple departments. I asked whether they understood the position they had put me in. I had worked dozens of unpaid hours, reported it 3 times, and nothing changed. What else was I supposed to do after that exchange? Diane said the company needed me to cooperate fully with the investigation. I said of course I would cooperate, because I had already documented everything they would need. That sentence made both of them go quiet. They turned back toward the administrative area, where uncomfortable questions were probably waiting: why multiple employees had been reclassified, who approved it, how the actual duties differed from the paperwork, and why labor costs had dropped sharply after Vanessa arrived. I picked up my clipboard and moved to the next shipment of packaging materials. There were 312 units to count, and I counted every one. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, the warehouse felt as if someone had turned down the volume. People spoke more quietly and moved more carefully. Vanessa stopped doing her morning walks through the work area. She stayed in her office more often. Door closed. Blinds not fully drawn, but enough to create distance. Sometimes I walked past and saw her sitting motionless in front of her screen. Her familiar smile gone. Investigators returned several times. They requested time records, emails, classification documents, job descriptions, and information about bonus structures. I was interviewed once for nearly an hour. The woman asking questions had short gray hair and eyes that made me feel she had heard every excuse in the world. She asked what my daily duties were, how many hours I worked, whether anyone had explicitly told me I no longer received overtime, and whether I had raised concerns internally before filing the complaint. I told her everything. I brought out my notebook, turned the pages, and for the first time, my careful record-keeping did not feel like a private burden. It became a voice. When the investigator asked whether I had noticed any pattern in the reclassifications, I said yes. They all happened within a few months after Vanessa took over. The people moved to salary were the same people who regularly worked overtime. Afterward, the department's overtime costs dropped dramatically. She asked whether Vanessa received bonuses tied to department performance or cost reduction. I said yes. That someone in accounting had mentioned the large year-end bonus and the 38% drop in costs. She wrote it down and simply said, the information was helpful. I did not know such a short sentence could make me feel that relieved. For months, everything I said inside the company had been twisted into misunderstanding, professional judgment, or lack of cooperation. But in that interview room, for the first time, someone treated the details as facts instead of inconveniences. The following weeks passed in a heavy state of waiting. I kept working, kept counting, but I no longer felt completely alone. Some coworkers started speaking to me more. One person thanked me very quietly while passing by. Another said nothing but placed a hand on my shoulder for 1 second and kept walking. I understood that they were still afraid. I was afraid too. I feared subtle retaliation, losing my job, being labeled a troublemaker. But fear no longer controlled my entire body. It walked beside me, while I kept moving forward. I realized courage is not like it appears in movies. It is not bright or certain. Sometimes it is simply carrying a notebook into an interview room and telling the truth while your hands are still shaking. 6 weeks and 2 days after the labor department first appeared, an email was sent to my entire department. Mandatory meeting in the break room at 2 in the afternoon. When I walked in, I saw not only people from my own team, but also several employees from other departments. Management was there, human resources was there, and someone from the legal team stood at the front with an expression that looked like physical pain. The room felt so heavy that nobody joked or made small talk. The legal representative began in a carefully controlled voice. She said the Labor Department had completed its investigation into classification practices and had determined that certain positions had been incorrectly classified as exempt from overtime. This had affected multiple employees across multiple departments. I sat still, both hands on my lap. My heart pounding so loudly, I worried the person next to me could hear it. She said the company was required to pay back wages for all unpaid overtime worked during the period of misclassification and would immediately implement corrective measures to ensure compliance. Diane stood after that and said each person would receive an individual notice about their back pay calculation. She said the company took the findings seriously and was committed to complying with labor law. Nobody asked anything. I think everyone was trying to understand what had just been said. Back pay. Not an apology. Not a listening session. But real money. Money we had earned through late nights, weekends, interrupted meals, and canceled plans because we were too exhausted to see friends. When the meeting ended, people left very slowly. I returned to my workstation and looked at the rows of numbers in front of me. But my hands would not stop shaking. Not from fear anymore. Because the truth had finally been called by its proper name. 2 days later, an envelope appeared on my workstation. Inside was a letter showing calculations of hours worked, overtime owed, and the amount the company had to pay me. I read the total, and everything blurred for a few seconds. $18,400. That was the amount held back from my life over 8 months. Not a small error. Not a few forgotten evenings. It was rent money, savings, medical money, car repair money, money for days when I had lived carefully while the company benefited from my time. But the bigger shock came 3 days later. When Vanessa's office was empty, her nameplate was gone. Her computer was gone. There was no farewell email. No long explanation. She simply vanished from the place that had once been the center of her small power. Rumors spread quickly. Someone said Vanessa had been terminated. Someone else said it was more serious, that the company was demanding she return her bonuses. At first, I did not understand. Then someone in accounting quietly told me in the parking lot that the investigation report had documented how Vanessa's bonus structure was directly connected to cost reductions achieved through employee misclassification. In other words, her bonuses were not merely rewards for good management. They were financial benefits created by unpaid labor. To protect itself from legal liability, the company calculated 3 years of bonuses and demanded that Vanessa repay $127,000. Apparently, she did not have that money available. She had bought a house and built her life around annual bonuses she believed would keep coming. I did not know whether every detail of the rumor was perfectly accurate. But the core truth was clear. The person who had saved money by taking from us now had to pay with her own. The following week, the back pay arrived. I took the check to the bank in a state of near silence. When the teller finished processing it and the new balance appeared, I stared at it for a long time. It was not a bonus. It was not a gift. It was not company generosity. It was money I had already earned long ago. It had only now found its way back to me. After Vanessa left, the company brought in Rachel Morgan as the new manager. Rachel was in her late 40s. With a calm voice and a direct gaze that did not make me feel as if I were being sold a story. The first thing she did was call a department meeting. Rachel said she had reviewed every position. And from that point forward, anyone who did not truly meet the standard for overtime exemption would be moved back to hourly status. We would track our time, be paid for every hour worked, and all qualifying overtime would be compensated at the correct rate. Someone asked whether we could keep the senior titles. Rachel said we could if we wanted to. But titles mattered less than fair compensation. She said we did good work and should be paid properly for it. The sentence was so simple that I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it should have been obvious from the beginning. I returned to inventory work. But this time, the system became honest again. If I worked 50 hours, I was paid for 50. If I worked 40, I was paid for 40. There were no polished words covering gaps in the paycheck. There was no feeling that every weekend shift was a piece of my life, taken without a receipt. Diane transferred to another location 3 weeks later. I never saw her again. Some people said she requested the move. Others said management suggested it. Either way, the office that once smelled of vanilla and old paper was no longer a place where I had to ask for the obvious. Vanessa's office stayed empty for 2 months, then became storage for administrative supplies. Sometimes I walk past and look inside. Boxes of paper, file folders, extra equipment. No nameplate. No calculating smile. No person sitting there deciding how much money could be saved by not paying us properly. 18 other employees also received back pay. The amounts varied depending on how long they had been misclassified and how much overtime they had worked. But in total, the company had to return $340,000. $340,000 in withheld wages. Returned, because one person finally stopped asking politely and started demanding through legal channels. I still work there. I still count inventory. I still organize shipments. I still notice when numbers do not match. My apartment is still small. My commute is the same. But something inside me feels lighter. People ask whether I was scared when I filed the complaint. Yes. I was terrified. But I was also exhausted. Exhausted from working 60 hours and being paid for 40. Exhausted from asking for basic fairness and being treated like an inconvenience. Thank you to everyone who watched until the end of this video. If this story reached you, please leave one like. Subscribe to the channel. And remember that sometimes making something a priority means placing it in the hands of people who actually have the power to fix it.